There's a famous story about a guy named Dean Karnazes and how he became a star ultramarathoner. Anybody familiar with him? I know that there's a couple people that are familiar with him here this morning, but you probably don't know who he is. Ultramarathoners are people that run beyond marathon distance, so they're really insane. So here's an insane story for you. On his 30th birthday, after not running for 15 years, and on the verge of a midlife crisis, Dean Karnazes set out one evening and ended up running 30 miles on a whim. The rest is history, as long-distance running's most famous showman was born. Now, I could run down his list of achievements, but since you already don't know who he is, you probably don't care. But saying his career as an ultra runner began by accident is probably enough for you to know about Dean Karnazes. But the reason I bring him up this morning is that unless you're completely nuts like him, it's really hard to go out and go that far on foot by accident. You might, miss a turn and end up in the next town if you're out driving in an unfamiliar place. But if you just walk out your door and end up someplace 30 miles away, that takes a special kind of crazy on a whim. When I think about running 30 miles or more, I think about a lot of things. I think about what I'm going to eat. I think about what I'm going to wear. I think about, if it's unsupported, how I'm going to carry water. Kind of normal preparation stuff that people would think of when they think about going mind-blowing distances. It takes planning, it takes preparation, and most of all, it takes training. You've got to have the physical and the mental ability to keep going when things get difficult. You don't just show up on a whim unless you're Dean Karnazes. And he's done countless hours of hard training since that first run. In fact, his motto comes from his very first high school coach. Go out hard, finish harder, right? Great motto. And you can't do that accidentally. When we really dedicate ourselves to something, that's when we see real success. Well, part of the challenge of faith is that sometimes we show up as if it were an accident. Do you ever just kind of pop your head up in the middle of a worship service, or maybe especially in the middle of a sermon, and say, how did I get here? Was it purely out of habit? Sometimes maybe even I do that. Just, whoa, how did I get here? Am I still challenging myself in my faith journey? When was the last time my relationship with God felt new and exciting instead of just kind of warmed over? Faith takes effort. A robust spiritual life takes time and energy and discipline, like really anything else in life. It's not as if the Old or the New Testament said that things would be easy. Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But most of his disciples discovered that by the end of Jesus' life, following their master was really hard to do. It was much more than they expected. Well, this morning I want to talk about what it takes to succeed in this journey called Christianity. It takes heart and it takes intention. And that's what our scriptures are about. The Bible shapes us for a mission that needs to go all the way to our hearts, the core of our being. If we don't let it get all the way there, we're not going to have what it takes to persevere and in faith when things get rough. Following Jesus, serving the least, the last, and the lost, speaking up for injustice, all of those things take the kind of resolution that's beyond human capability. We need to allow God to empower us to do these things. And when we do that, we see what the Apostle Paul meant when he said that God can do far more than we can ask or imagine. It's a mission of the heart, or more properly speaking, it's a mission from the heart. And God makes it happen through us. Now today we have a couple of passages, and I'd like to invite you to open your Bibles to Deuteronomy and later on to Matthew chapter 5. We have this one passage from the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy and one passage from the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. Now what's interesting is that both of these passages are sermons. The whole book of Deuteronomy is really a sermon or a series of sermons preached by Moses at the end of his life, just before the Israelites enter the promised land. He says to his people in our passage that if they're going to succeed in this new land, then they need to follow God with their whole heart. And they need to obey him with all that they have and all that they are. If they imitate the other people of the land, then they abandon God's purpose for them. He urges them to choose life with God over life without God. God offers them a better way, but they need to embrace it with their whole heart. So take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 17 and 18. Moses says, "But if you turn your hearts away and you are not obedient, if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan River to enter and possess." Now, at first, take a look at that statement. On its face value, that sounds like a pretty threatening statement from God, right? Choose my way or I'll get you. It even sounds maybe a little abusive, doesn't it? Just admit it. But that's not really what God is saying here. There's more to the story than just that. All the people of the land that had lived in this particular place in the land have been pretty transient. They come and they go and they're swept away by the next invading army or the next group of nomads. God is offering the people something that will last beyond what was expected in this land. Something that will last if they choose him. Moses is asking the people whether they want to be a part of something temporary or a part of something permanent. If they abandon God, they'll simply suffer the same fate that every other group of people has suffered that has ever lived in this place before. This is not an easy place to live, is what Moses is saying. If they want to be like the rest of the people in the land, then God will let them choose that. Only they'll end up just like all the other people of the land, swept away and lost to history. Now, you may just want to be a regular person. You may want to be left alone, and you can choose that. But God gives us the freedom to do that, to make that choice, what we want to do with our lives. But if we want to be extraordinary in this world, if we want to bring about the things that give hope and new life to our community, then we have to choose life. We have to choose to be different. So be different, be extraordinary, says Moses. Take a look at the second half of verse 19 and following with me. Moses says, now choose life. Choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You have to put your heart into it if you're going to succeed. Follow God's law with your whole heart, and it will go well with you. Now, it's interesting to see how the idea of following God's law evolved, because it doesn't evolve in the way Moses' sermon in Deuteronomy expects. If we fast forward 1,000 years to Jesus' day, and this is a kind of an encouragement to flip over to Matthew, we find a very strong religious legal culture. But let me ask you a question. When humans make rules, do they ever make them simpler over time? Think about the Constitution of the United States. Is it simpler now or more complex? It went from one document to volumes of commentary, right? And that's only in a couple hundred years. Well, imagine this law that's the most highly regarded thing in a society. Imagine what would happen to it over 1,000 years. That's what happened to the law of Moses. This massive legal code has grown up that only a scholar can possibly hope to understand. For the ordinary person, following the law has become nearly impossible. Now, Jesus' culture is very religious, but it's also full of confusion and misunderstanding. It's not unlike our own religious culture today. Very religious in many ways, but very confused. If you look at the people's experience with the law and the unfolding story of the Old Testament, their encounter with their failure to live up to the standards of the law, and then God's forgiveness and restoration. It's just, the whole Old Testament, from the giving of the law forward through the prophets, is a story about the people's failure and God's restoration, time after time after time after time after time. And it shapes them in a very interesting way. Instead of a kind of a warm relationship with God, they've taken the law given by Moses and they've boiled it down to this legalistic and complicated formula. The law was supposed to serve as a feast for people who were starving for a relationship with God. But instead it's kind of become this filling gruel of regulations. It's unappetizing. It's like as if they took a piece of prime rib and instead of just, cooking it nicely for a little bit so it's full of flavor, they just kind of threw it in a pot of boiling water and they just boiled it and boiled it and boiled it and boiled it. Would you eat that? That's what happened to the law. So Jesus comes into this situation to reinterpret the law for the people in his Sermon on the Mount. Now, take a look at Matthew chapter 5, and if you back up a few verses to verse 20, we find this statement here from Jesus. He says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, what does Jesus mean by that? What does it mean to follow the law better than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who were known for keeping the law perfectly? How can a person do it better than them? Well, verses 21 through 48 are Jesus' explanation of how to do it better, what that means. So we have two sections, and we'll look at these two sections over these next 2 weeks. But our first section is found in verses 21 through 32. And he covers three subjects: murder, adultery, and divorce. And Jesus takes these three things as an example of how he reinterprets the law so that the people can truly live it. He begins each section this way: "You've heard that it was said." You've heard that it was said. And he gives the law and the conventional wisdom of the day. But then he stops. And he says this: "But I tell you," and as soon as he says, "but I tell you," in there, that's an encouragement for you to pay attention, because he's going to change something. Something's going to be different. So let's take a look at what he does, because I think what he's doing is he's actually pointing his followers in this sermon back to an interpretation of the law of Moses that brings life and reconciliation. Probably an interpretation that Moses may have intended in the first place, instead of the legalism and the shame that the people feel. Now, let's take a look at the first one: murder. Now, it seems like a pretty easy thing to avoid, right? Murder, and just don't kill somebody. Okay, I can do that. But Jesus says this. Take a look at verse 22. He says, "But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment." Now, this isn't just your family relationships. This is all the people of the community, your extended church family, your brothers and your sisters. Anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment. And again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," now Raka is meaningless to you, but that's an insult in the Aramaic language. Anyone who says to his brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court. If you defame somebody, they'll drag you to court. And anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now for Jesus, murder is just the final outcome. It's not murder that breaks the relationship between people. It's what comes from the heart. It's anger that's at the issue here, and the reaction to anger. Jesus doesn't tell us to be afraid of our anger. Instead, he tells us to act on it differently than we might expect. Anger is a sign that something is wrong and needs to be fixed. Use your anger not to hurt people that have wronged you, but to mend the relationship. Because if you go a little further in that passage, Jesus uses an example of what he's talking about. Don't worship God with an angry heart. If you know something is wrong, before you give your offering to God, get up and mend the relationship. Go and be reconciled with your brother or sister. Do you have an ugly court battle coming up with somebody? Mediate it out across the table, face to face. Work it out before you even get into court, because you know what? In court, you may lose. You may pay a much higher price. The things that Jesus asks us to do are more difficult. They don't come naturally. It requires a great deal of self-control not to strike out against someone in some way. But the benefit always outweighs the cost. Reconciliation means that when the matter is truly over, the relationship is made whole again. There's no kind of endless spinning and churning of cycle of revenge. Jesus' ethic. Now there are some important limits or caveats that we need to pay attention to for Jesus' teaching here. It's important to remember that just as Moses was preaching to the Israelites in Deuteronomy, Jesus is speaking to his followers. These are people that have already chosen to follow him. This is kind of a sermon to insiders. He's asking them to make this commitment to each other. He's not asking his followers to be doormats for the world. He's teaching them this ethic within the context of their relationships with each other, to show the world a different way of living out and responding to anger. But that's still not any easier of a task, is it? I mean, it doesn't matter whether he's talking about the people in this room, the people in our church community, or the people outside the doors. It's still not an easy task to use anger in a different way. When I think about our own situation as a denomination in the United Methodist Church, we have a divided denomination today. There's a great deal of anger between people on the left and people on the right. And everyone thinks that each side should just kind of pick up their toys and go home. Jesus is asking us within the church to be held to a different standard. Not to choose the way of division, but to choose the way of reconciliation and life. I mean, how can the church show our country how to be united together as one family if it can't be united to itself? It's a hard question. We may not be able to change our denomination today, but we can practice these things here, right now, within our own community. So what is your intention? What's coming from your heart? What do you do when you feel your anger rising? Because the question is, can we live together? It's a hard commitment, but it's one that brings light and light. Not just in here, but shows people a better way. It's a mission of the heart. Now, how about these other two things that Jesus covers? Adultery and divorce. Now again, it's not, for most people at least, it's not too tall of an order not to cheat on your spouse. Now I realize that cheating on one spouse happens a little bit more than murder in this world, but it's still fairly rare. Well, what about looking? What's your intention? Do you want to cheat and you just don't have the nerve? Jesus says, be careful with your intentions. What's going on in your heart? Now, if you look at the Levitical law, the law of Moses, or at least the way the Levitical law was interpreted, the onus for adultery was almost always placed on the woman. It wasn't intended that way, but it was interpreted that way. If you think about the woman caught in sin who's about to be stoned, whose life Jesus saves a little later, it's all about her, isn't it? What happened to the guy? He might be throwing stones. We've maybe heard of this before. It happened a lot at Jesus' day. She enticed me. It was also said all too often, any woman lost her life or was cast out of her community, even in cases of rape. But what does Jesus say? Well, he changes things, doesn't he? He says, I tell you, in verse 28, take a look, I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus is saying that every person in his community has to take responsibility for what's going on with their heart. You have to take responsibility for your intentions. You can't blame someone for your actions. It doesn't matter what she was wearing. It doesn't matter if he looked good. Your intentions are what matter. Your intentions should be a signal for you to take action, not to act things out, but to stop. Don't break the relationships around you by even looking at someone with the wrong intentions. Because people are not objects. They're not there for our own self-satisfaction. And finally, again, with divorce, Jesus is talking to many of the men of his day that practice kind of a serial monogamy by divorcing their wives for someone new. Women in Jesus' culture were always left high and dry. And Jesus calls his followers, especially his male followers, to a higher standard. A standard that means life and wholeness for everyone, not just their own pursuit of happiness. It's not about you, Jesus says. It's about all the relationships in the community. To have a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law means that it's not good enough just to follow the letter of the law. Instead, it's about your intentions. It's about your heart. Now, I think that culturally, we may have made a big mistake about what it means to follow your heart. You just follow your heart, right? Your dreams will come true or something. Because the way we've been doing it hasn't made us any happier, and it certainly hasn't helped our culture or make our society any better. Maybe when we feel fire or passion in our hearts, maybe it's not an encouragement to indulge in that. Maybe instead it's a warning sign. Maybe all that heat is really the temperature of the danger zone. We don't want to take the highway to the danger zone. I want to call Kenny Loggins Goose and Maverick. Our hearts tell us where things are out of whack in our lives. If you feel angry, it's just a sign that some reconciliation needs to be done. Are you full of lust? You need to be careful. Do you want a divorce? Don't leave your partner high and dry just because you're unhappy. Reconcile your relationship with your spouse. Mastering our intentions is much more important than following the letter of the law. It's easy to follow the letter of, well, relatively easy to follow the letter of the law, because when we follow the letter of the law, we understand where we are. We understand. I broke the law, okay. I followed the law, okay. But our intentions, that's murky, isn't it? It requires a lot of self-examination. That's the thing that really matters in Jesus' ethic. Jesus' ethic of interpreting law, it's people that matter. It's relationships that matter. It's a mission of the heart and what comes from the heart. It's a better way, but it requires more than just a skin-deep commitment. You can't do it by accident. You can't accidentally go on a long hike or run by accident for 30 miles. I mean, there are no Dean Carneses in this room, are there? No. Athletically or spiritually, I would imagine. I'm certainly not. You've got to choose the way you'll go. And then you have to add effort and discipline to your journey. So I encourage you, like Moses, if I can possibly stand up like him, probably not. But I encourage you to choose life this morning. Choose it daily so that we can get to the business of transforming our city and our community with God's help. We don't want to just stay where we are. We want to move on. We want to train so that we can go on to greater things.